per stream from major streaming services. It's a little bit not factually accurate because the way that artists are paid in streaming is through this really complicated revenue share arrangement. But uh, the impact on musicians, in some ways, has become like maybe clear in a straightforward way. There are other impacts on musicians that I try to outline in the book, such as the way in which streaming has sort of um, uh, pushed artists to think of what they do, to think of themselves more as like content creators than
Mm-hmm.
musicians, has sort of pushed this kind of individualistic, atomized content creator, sort of musician influencer model of what it means to be an independent musician. All of the data that musicians are now confronted with, all of the ways in that impacts how they conceptualize what they do as artists, because you're constantly bombarded with just all of these stats. I think any creative person knows that it can really cloud your sense of like what you're doing, your own creativity, when you're constantly being bombarded with stats about your own work.
Yes. I'm confronted with that in my own work here on YouTube. I post a video and then I look at the dashboard. It tells me how many people watched it and they stopped watching it after X number of minutes. And this one's performing not as well as the other one. And it makes you tune what you're doing to the algorithm. That's actually the entire point, is it's training you to make stuff that does well on the algorithm, as opposed to following your own taste or listening to your audience organically.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Something that I always think about, especially as a writer, there's all these platforms for writers to like do newsletters, and the platform economy has come for journalists now as well, in some ways,
Right.
and in some ways, it's interesting. You have these platforms that offer you all these stats about your articles, and people click this link, people, opens this for this many minutes, this was popular, this wasn't. And I always think about like, for 2 years after I graduated from college, I worked at a newspaper, and it was this very straightforward thing. When you walked in the door, like the editorial people sat on this side and the marketing people sat on this side. And obviously people talk to each other, but in some ways, like if you sat on the editorial side of the office, like what you did was pretty different than what happened on the other side of the office. And in some ways it was like, yeah, I'd kind of rather not know what's going on over there. Just let me, write my articles and like not have to think about that stuff.
Yeah.
It's a kind of interesting how like muddled that has become in this era of these like so-called creator platforms.
Well, it's part of turning us as artists or journalists or other people who create things into content creators, which is another word for Uber driver. When you're a content creator, you are just freelancing for the algorithm, and they are giving you all this data so that you can feed the algorithm better and hopefully make some money. But the reason for you trying to make your content better so you can make money is because they're not paying most people. So you're part of a system, whether you're on YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, Spotify, you're part of a system where like hardly anybody's being paid, but they're giving you stats. And hey, if you increase your stats, maybe you could be one of the lucky ones who does get paid. Maybe you could be Hassan Piker or, whatever, whoever's big on YouTube, whoever's big on Spotify. If you tune it just right, it's part of like proving why you're not making money. To because they're saying you suck, and if you were better, you would make more money, as opposed to, again, allowing you to focus on your art. And I think this is true of all these different fields, but there's something special about music that makes us dislike this idea, because there's a place for music where the artist is trying to optimize how well it does. That's what Brian Wilson was doing when he was trying to get Beach Boys songs on, to hit number one. He was trying to make something that would work on the radio. There's a place for that in pop, but we also really treasure artists who are just making work that comes from their heart, and they don't give a fuck whether or not we like it or whether the algorithm likes it, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it gets, harder and harder for musicians who are trying to operate in that kind of like art first space to like find ways to sustain what they're doing in a, economy that is so hostile to not just music, but like the arts in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, like So just to like tie the loop on the opening question that you're asking about consequences. So the book like
Yes.
starts with the listener and sort of like looks at all of the different ways in which like streaming has had consequences for the listener and the way that it's sort of like um, reshaping the way that people find music, the types of music that is incentivized, the sorts of things that end up on the playlists that you might be listening to, the types of listening behaviors that are incentivized. And the other half of the book, like I mentioned, is about the impact on the artist. And it's not necessarily this like neat, like when I started writing, it was in these two halves and the structure kind of like, bled into each other over time. But part of the reason why I was thinking about it in these two ways is because in Spotify's own explanation of its business model, it refers to itself as a two-sided marketplace where it says that on one side, it is selling a product to listeners, subscriptions. And on the other side, it's selling a product to musicians, which are all of these promotional opportunities on the platforms, or they're selling advertisements, they're selling so they actually, to some extent, like think of the musicians who are trying to circulate their work on the platform and try to maybe, piece together a living. Like they actually see them as customers, not necessarily as like people creating, people laboring and creating work that makes their whole scheme possible.
Yeah, that sounds like a nice way to relabel a grift to me. It reminds me again of Uber, right? Where Uber would make ads that were aimed at the drivers. You should drive for Uber because we're your side hustle. We're how you're going to pay for that nice meal out because you drove a couple Uber rides. And it makes sense to rebrand your barely paid workforce as a customer base that you are empowering if you want to distract people, if you want to distract the public from the fact that that is what you have done, is you have impoverished a base of laborers. Oh, no, they're not laborers. They're customers who are taking advantage of our wonderful product. That's what it sounds like to me. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I have like a whole chapter in my book, chapter 14, that's literally called An App for a Boss. And it's about exactly what you're describing, which is like the sort of parallels between this sort of, atomized individual musician, content creator held up as this like model independent artist in the streaming era, and the parallels between, other gig workers essentially. And yeah, it totally makes sense. Like, I think you put it really well that if you have a, workforce that's not being paid, compensated fairly, like, how do you deal with that? Like, oh yeah, let's just pretend that they're customers.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, you keep saying things that keep like ringing in my head as, oh, that's true of me. You said an app for a boss. I'm like, yeah, that's my boss now. My boss is the YouTube algorithm because that's where, most of my work goes up. My boss used to be a person at a cable company who was, would make a specific request of me, and I negotiated my relationship with them, et cetera, et cetera. And we had real people who we were trying to reach. And now my boss is this app on my phone that says, oh, you did a good job this week. Literally sends me a recap every week. Oh, good job. You got your numbers up this week. Try again next week. And so I'm a part of this fucking apocalyptic future as well. Let's jump in, though, and talk about some of the most shocking revelations in your book, because I think they're going to be a good way to get into this broader conversation about Spotify. You uncovered that Spotify is using something called ghost artists in their library. What are ghost artists?
Yeah. So in the first half of the book where I'm talking about, the impact of Spotify on the listener, I sort of trace an early history of the company. And I talk about how when Spotify launched, it really was more like a search bar. You had to know what you were looking for. You had to be looking for a specific album or a specific artist. And it was really only as the company expanded and was trying to grow after it launched in the United States, was trying to grow its user base, that it turned more towards curation and these like in-house curated playlists, algorithmic recommendations. And with the sort of rise of the streaming playlist also came sort of this popularizing and championing of what the music industry over the years called the lean back listener. So, someone who is happy to just put on a study playlist or a, focus playlist or a dinner playlist and have it play in the background. And, maybe was less concerned with exactly what artists are on that playlist or anything like that. But, it was just looking basically for like sounds to fill their days.
Can I just say, this is like a whole form of listening that was fully enabled by streaming. You couldn't really do that apart from putting on the radio in the CD era or even in the MP3 era to just like, I want to hit play and have an infinite amount of music play. And I started, once I got, I'm not a Spotify user, I use Apple Music, but once I got it, I started listening. That listening pattern sort of organically developed in my life as well. And so I understand why they latched onto this as, oh, here's a new type of listening that is only possible on our platforms. Let's support it.
Yeah, you are right though. Like, the concept of the lean back listener wasn't like created in the streaming era, but it was, I think, definitely like really championed and popularized and normalized. There were like different versions of lean back listening in the radio era. And some might even say that the digital service that really pioneered this was more like Pandora than necessarily Spotify. But I think there's a particular reason why lean back listening has become so popular in the streaming era, which is that, optimizing for the lean back listener is a way to optimize for listeners that are, quote unquote engaged. It's funny, like how engaged are you really if you're just leaving music on in the background all day? But users who stream endlessly, like, all day long and who are generating the most data and whose engagement metrics are, the highest. And yeah, all sorts of things we could talk about. But for the sake of the ghost artist conversation, it would appear that there is, a moment in Spotify's history where their executives realized that if so many of their users were coming for playlists and not necessarily concerned with the music that was on the playlist, but more just looking for something to fill their day, that, like I think in my book, I write, the thinking seemed to be like, why pay full price royalties if listeners were only half listening? So starting in about 2016, 2017, these stories started popping up in the music industry trade press. One of the first ones was in Music Business Worldwide, which is like the one of the main music industry trade publications. And it was a story claiming that a source had told them that Spotify was creating its own fake artists to fill its lean back playlists for studying and sleeping and focusing, and that artists in genres like jazz, classical, ambient, and lo-fi hip hop were being affected by this. And over the years, the story would sort of bubble up in the trade press here and there. Spotify always denied that they were creating these artists, but they never really denied the existence of some sort of broader arrangement. But it was always really mysterious. I feel like for like almost a decade, it was sort of this like unsolved mystery. Like, who are these fake artists? Like, how is this happening? What's the deal? A lot of times you would see people on social media, like every few years, a post would go viral where someone would go, hey, look, I was listening to this study playlist and I noticed that all the artists on this playlist, their album is attributed to a stock music company called Epidemic Sound based in Sweden. The artist,
I know that company. We've used them on my television shows before. We've used Epidemic Sound Library stuff.
Yeah, so very interesting. So Epidemic Sound is one of the main like partners in this program at Spotify. These artists, their work is attributed to these stock music libraries. The artist profiles, they have this like generic AI generated art. There's no profile or bio, and you Google the names of these musicians. There's nothing about them anywhere on the internet. Some people are just like, oh, it's just stock music, but some people, it raised, more questions for them because these musicians, these tracks were getting really prominent placement on really popular playlists on Spotify made by Spotify. They're editorial playlists. So, Spotify has a team of in-house editorial playlists. And a lot of these tracks were, getting millions of streams and like really popular on these playlists. In 2022, a Swedish newspaper did some more reporting on the subject, and they were able to use documents that they got access to through a royalty collection agency in Sweden to determine that there were, hundreds and hundreds of tracks released under different pseudonyms that could be attributed to just this really small group of songwriters based in Sweden, and that they were all connected to this company called Firefly Entertainment, this like really mysterious company that no one knew anything about. I had like personally, as soon as I started covering Spotify, which was in the first article I wrote about Spotify came out in 2017. Someone who worked at an independent record label emailed me and was like, you should cover this fake artist story. Like, no one knows what's going on. It seems like Spotify is making fake artists, and like it's affecting, artists who make instrumental music. So I knew that when I started writing the book, it was like one of those things I'd have to dig into. And I was actually, really surprised when I started interviewing musicians, people who worked in the music business, former Spotify employees. And then for the book, I cite internal Slack conversations that I was able to review, like some internal documents that I was able to review. And it turns out that there's actually like this team internally on Spotify, and this is a program that has a name called the Perfect Fit Content Program. And there's a specific, group of playlist editors that look after these specific playlists that are sort of these more like ambient relaxation background playlists, things you might listen to when you're like eating dinner. And then there's this specific group of production companies that make this music, including Epidemic Sound and Firefly, and also like, a list of several others. And they're the ones that are commissioning artists to make this music. And then there's a special, licensing deal in place wherein Spotify licenses this music for a rate that allows them to make money. So you would assume like a lower royalty rate because from what I was able to review and talking to former employees, it's very clear this is a program through which the company saves money, and that it's music. Their internal description of the PFC program is like music commissioned to fit certain playlists and moods with improved margins for us.
Imagine that it's the year 2019. You've just gone to a minor league baseball game with some friends. You're enjoying the fresh air, the low-stakes ball game, and most of all, you enjoy that little bit of the game where the guys in mascot condiment costumes race around the bases. Mustard even wins. It's a perfect day for you. That is, until your friends go to pay you back for the tickets. Danielle, Tyrese, and Bethany each owe you $20, but they don't carry cash anymore. The day is ruined. The friendships are over, and it sends you off on a dark spiral that you're still stewing about 6 years later. A spiral that could have been so easily avoided if you, used Cash App. Cash App is simply the best way to zap money straight to your friends. It is fast, it is safe, it is so quick to get started, and there are zero extra hoops to jump through. Just sign up, and before you know it, you'll be seeing minor league baseball whenever you want without the threat of it ruining your friendship with Bethany. Cash App does more than you think when it comes to having your back and making sure your money stays your money. If you direct deposit at least $300 in paychecks each month and use the Cash App card for purchases, you can unlock up to $200 in free overdraft coverage. If you overdraft unexpectedly, there are no hidden fees. Manage your money on your terms and take advantage of free overdraft coverage up to $200 on Cash App today. And for a limited time only, new Cash App customers can use our exclusive code to earn some additional cash for real. Just download Cash App, use our exclusive referral code factually in your profile, send $5 to a friend within 14 days, and you'll get $10 dropped right into your account. Terms apply. That's money. That's Cash App. Folks, this episode is brought to you by Alma. How often do you feel heard? Like, really genuinely heard? For a lot of us, the answer is not enough. It can be so isolating to feel unheard or like you're lacking a sense of connection in your everyday life. This only feels worse if you're struggling with your mental health. And that's why I want to tell you about Alma. Alma makes it simple to find a licensed therapist who gets you, someone who can offer support tailored to your specific needs and goals and make sure that you are actually being heard. In fact, 83% of people who see a therapist through Alma say that their provider is the right fit. And Alma therapists bring real experience to the table, on average 6 years of it, with 20% practicing for over a decade. Their easy-to-use directory lets you filter by things like gender, specialty, ethnicity, and more, so you can find someone you truly connect with. You can even schedule free 15-minute consultations to make sure it feels right before even committing to a session. Better with people, better with Alma. Visit helloalma.com/factually to get started and schedule a free consultation today. That's helloalma.com/factually.
So there's about a million things that are fucked up about this. So let's be clear. Spotify is paying stock music companies to provide like music to them under fake artist names that they then pay a lower rate for, and they put in playlists that their own customers are listening to, and the customers don't know that that is what they're listening to. It's not disclosed anywhere. There's no thing in italics, hey, guess what? This is Spotify original music or something like that. It's just slipped in there. So the first thing that's fucked up is, the public doesn't know. We have a presumption of how music works that Spotify tells us that these are all the greatest. We have every artist from around the world making music. We don't have any expectation when we're listening to Spotify that some of the songs are made by fake people. I mean, it's just they're creating an army of Milli Vanillis out there, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just like to clarify one thing, if you in Spotify's telling of it, just to like be clear about like how they've characterized it, is that they say that none of these artists are guaranteed placement on playlists, but that there clearly is an arrangement where these companies are providing this music. There's a direct line of communication between the companies providing this music and this certain group of playlists editors, and then they are getting paid with a different type of royalty arrangement that makes it more profitable for Spotify. But yeah, the thing about it that to me, one of the main things that makes it concerning is exactly what you said, that it's not labeled for the public. And I think that's something that is really important, is that, these playlists, at Spotify, these like editor curated playlists since the beginning of the Spotify playlist ecosystem emerging, have been presented as editorial. And I think that in any other situation, if you were being recommended something under the banner of editorial and there were secret commercial arrangements that were influencing actually why you had been recommended the song, like that would be considered, noteworthy or wrong or cause for alarm. So it's deceptive to listeners in that regard, I think.
That is wild. And I can understand how we got to this place, right? Like I think about maybe 5-6 years ago, the YouTube channel Lo-Fi Beats to Study and or Relax to was a big hit, right? And that collected all this music that was like sort of an organic genre of music that people were putting on SoundCloud and stuff, of these low-key beats, like with like just a little bit of saxophone or whatever, low-key beat. A lot of people started listening to that, and I'm an Apple Music user. Apple Music popped up a couple playlists in that theme, right? There's like one called Bedtime Beats. There's one called like Beatstrumentals. And I would listen to those playlists and go, all these songs sound pretty similar. Where, who are these artists? And I started like looking up some of the artist names, and sometimes I would see on Twitter, they'd be like, oh, I got on the Apple Music playlist. I'm excited. I was like, okay, these are artists who, now that the playlist exists, they are pumping out music specifically to feed the playlist, right? Maybe it's even music they don't care about that much, but they're like, hey, if one of these ends up on the playlist, maybe I'll make $500 or something like that, whatever the royalty rate is. That itself is already a sort of slightly odd commercialization of music, right? Because it's no longer an organic form. It's like someone is trying to feed the playlist. But it is such a short hop from that to the company saying, you know what? Why are we even bothering to pay people at a higher rate to come in the door and give us stuff that we might like? What if we just like pay some company less than average to just churn the shit out for us? And I think what that does to the music is it removes the artist from the equation, right? It turns it into nothing but a commodity, like a widget factory. Hey, well, yeah, let's just get someone to give us widgets. Who cares who the fuck made it? Well, us caring about the artist that made the music has been like a foundational part of American, at the very least, music culture for more than a century, right? Like having the name of the artist and being like, I give a shit who that is. Oh, I like Scott Joplin or whatever, right? That's been what music is to us. And this is a severing of the artist from the music in a way that's kind of unsettling.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny that you bring up lo-fi hip hop beats to study and relax to also, because in my book, Ghost Artists is chapter 5, and chapter 4 is the chapter called The Conquest of Chill, where I sort of talk about this phenomenon of the concept of the chill playlist as sort of like a current day cultural phenomenon, and try to historicize it a little bit in the history of like mood music and Muzak and,